Hitvi, you're muted.
Sorry.
There
Yeah,
we go.
yeah. Hello and a very warm welcome to all our you viewers from across the globe. You are tuned into episode 35 of our ongoing Decoding in AI in Healthcare series. I'm your host, Hetvi Shah, and today we delve into one of the most critical and timely topics, which is managing privacy on LLMs. And our very special guest is someone who is not just driving change but redefining how we think about AI in healthcare. So please join me in welcoming Sigrid Berge van Rooijen, a true pioneer in integrating AI into healthcare with heart, purpose, and precision. Sigrid's journey is deeply personal, inspired by her own experience with non standard treatment. She became a passionate advocate for AI powered personalized care. From training clinicians across sectors to unwavering emphasis on ethical AI and patient safety, she is helping healthcare professionals adopt AI not just intelligently but responsibly. So, Sigrid, we're absolutely thrilled to have you with us today.
Thank you.
And joining us is our powerhouse host, who is Dr. Dipu Patel, a tech-savvy clinician and educator leading innovation in healthcare delivery in the US. So welcome back, Dipu, and it's a pleasure to have you back.
Thank you, Hitvi, and welcome, Sigrid. It's a pleasure and an honor to have you here today. Welcome to our audience. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. We are diving into what is very quickly, I guess not very quickly, but becoming a very important topic as we dive into making large language models very ubiquitous in the work that we do on a daily basis. So I'm really excited to have Sigrid here because it was actually one of her posts on LinkedIn that inspired me to reach out to her to ask her to share her expertise and knowledge around large language models and privacy. As we start using these models in healthcare, care delivery, teaching, in my case, it's becoming more and more important that we understand how the privacy implications are impacting the care that we're delivering. So I'm going to start off the podcast with the elephant in the room type question, which is, are what are the biggest privacy concerns when using large language models like ChatGPT, Claude, or Gemini?
Um, yeah. Hi. Thank you for having me, Dipu. Well, first of all, LLMs. It's becoming more and more common. It's something you have around. You have it in your pocket all the time. If you've downloaded the app on your phone,
Yep.
you have it. It's there, right? Um, so it's become something everyone's using.
Mm-hmm.
Almost everyone. I don't think my mom has jumped on the train yet.
Yeah, I don't think my parents have it either.
But when you collect data, or when you have an input into these LLMs, you need to think about what type of data it collects. So, what does it collect? Where does it store it? Which
Mhm,
is specifically relevant for Europe and GDPR,
mhm,
and what will it be used for? So depending on the tool, that's going to be different. So it's not like, oh, okay, it's going to collect it for this and this purpose, or it's going to store it here and here. No, that's different. And especially when DeepSeek came, was it
Yes.
startup? There were a lot of discussions. So I'm based in Europe, and there were a lot of discussions in the media, on LinkedIn, everywhere. Like, so where's this data stored? What is this going to be used for? So one, what's going to be collected? Is it just the data inputs? Which is also not just. Is it the prompts? Does it collect uploads, log files? Some even collect keyboard patterns. So, and then with all this data that's been collected, what is it going to be used for?
Right.
So, is it being used for new training, product improvement? What is that? Or are they sharing that data with third parties? This was especially discussed with DeepSeek. So these third parties are these advertising parties?
Yeah.
Are these authorities? What are they using this data for?
Right.
So yes, there are some concerns. And then lastly, how secure is the data? How secure is the data that you're collecting? Because they do collect some data, right? You can't, you have to have some data.
Right.
So how are they using, or say that you're using LLM to support a diagnosis or treatment diagnosis. For example, I don't know if you heard about sickle cell.
Yeah.
But it's very common in some societies, so African descent. But in other societies, you won't have it. But say that you're living, so I'm from Norway, I'm from a village in Norway, and you'd had someone with sickle cell from there. If the LLM, and I'm just like checking, okay, so what type of treatment options are there for, I don't know, maybe I even say the age of that, a child of 6 years with sickle cell. And if they see my IP address, well, in that village, I can tell you there's going to be one person with sickle cell,
Right.
in that region even.
It's
So
rare.
it's these things that you think, okay, sickle cell, well, it's quite common ish, right? But
Yeah.
it really depends on where you are. So what are you? So how secure is that data that you are putting into it,
Yep.
and what data are you putting into it as well? Because if something is hacked, if you can identify, if something is leaked from that prompt,
Right.
one could easily figure out. Not even for, so say this example with sickle cell, not just, okay, someone has sickle cell, but they could easily figure out who that is because you could see that on the skin color most often.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the pieces of advice that I give to folks who are engaging with the use of large language models is try to de-identify as much data. First of all, at least in the US, you should not be putting any patient information into these models, period, because even if you're turning off in the settings, like don't use my data to train the model, which you can do in ChatGPT, and I'll be curious to see what kind of settings you would recommend for each of these more common models that we have for free use. But really being mindful of what you're putting in, because you're right, it's not just what you're putting into the prompt or what it's spitting out, it's tracking your IP address and the keystroke patterns, all of these things that we don't, at least the layperson does not intuitively think that that is quote data, right? Me typing a sequence of letters that create a sentence, we don't see that quote as data, although it is data that is being collected in some cases. And I think in DeepSeek it was the case, if I'm not mistaken, the keystone pattern things specifically. So what would your take be on, let's take the three that I talked about, ChatGPT, Gemini, and Claude. What are your kind of takeaways of how do you protect your privacy? And let's talk settings, I guess, in each of those, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah. So first of all, like, I don't use all of those tools, but I would look into each, like the tool that you choose to use, or if there's several, what type of settings are there. I normally, that's just me, and I think my husband's like, with like not sharing the data. So as strict privacy as possible
Right.
put on. So not sharing it for training, not sharing it for for advertising or
Right.
whatever be, just turn it off if you have that option. It also depends on the tool, right? Because some tools don't give you that option. Some give you that
Mhm.
option if you have a paid version or not. But try to look into and educate yourself into what information you are sharing. But also, so I think it's more nuanced than that, honestly, because it depends on what you're using that data for. If you're
Yes.
just trying to figure out, okay, so how many people in the world have sickle cell, or like, things like that, it's not sensitive data. Uh, it might not be correct the answer you have. That's another
Yes.
question. Uh,
And you're right. Like if you're looking up what do I make for dinner, not a
yeah,
problem, right? Like
yeah,
that's fine.
yeah.
But I think it would behoove everyone to kind of pause before you put in a prompt and say, is this something that I want out there in the world?
Hmm.
Even if you have all your privacy settings um, on and you are not quote training the model, is this something that you would want? And I kind of feel like we as a society and as a culture have really lowered our barriers to entry for these models, and I think Google has helped us do that because we Google so many things these
Yeah,
days, and Google tracks everything
yeah, yeah,
in
yeah.
many ways, and so there's not much that Google doesn't know about my life at this point, and so
Hmm.
we really have to be mindful. And what I really like about the conversations like these that we're having is that we're having them up front, not after the fact,
Hmm.
and I think that's where I think it was in your post, Sigrid, you had mentioned like you really should know what you're doing and be mindful of what you're sharing, how you're sharing it, and the intentionality with which you're sharing it. Because so think about it before it's already out there for other people to consume in whatever fashion that may be.
Hmm.
If we were, you know, and I guess we'll shift to the conversation to have how LLMs quote remember things and what happens to the data users input. So it's not just about the output, right? Like you enter your prompt and you get your answer. So it's not just about the answer. It's about what questions are you asking. In fact, most models are more interested in what you're asking than what it's putting out,
Hmm.
because that's where truly the training happens. Because the
Yeah.
humans are the ones kind of entering the thing. The output are just tokens for the model itself. So talk to me about the remembering of things and what happens with that data user input.
Yeah. I don't know if I'm the expert to ask for this, just to but um, but yeah, LLMs are trained on enormous data sets, and I think we've talked for a long time about like data being the new gold.
Yeah,
I have not always, but
yeah,
quite often disagreed with that because it's not really the data that is the new gold; it's what we do with the data.
that's right.
Um, but it's trained on these amounts of data, so now suddenly things are happening with that data we've called the gold.
Mhm.
And it's learning statistical patterns, it's learning relationships between words and phrases.
Mhm.
It doesn't necessarily understand
Yeah,
everything. Um, and so memorizing this, it's not memorizing the whole context, it's memorizing pieces of it,
but yeah.
right? But larger LLMs, they tend to memorize more exact pieces of training data.
Mhm.
So that means that if your LM is more accurate, they have remembered more.
Right.
Like,
So more accurate equals fewer hallucinations, right?
yeah,
That's what we're looking at. Yep.
yeah, and also the amount of like details you have in your data,
Hmm.
the outputs that you get. Um, so the models, it's the data. They won't remember dog. They remember mathematical representations of that language.
Right.
So it's really it's not the same way we would remember it. It's a computer. Um, so so it doesn't really necessarily remember this like personal data, but it's like when you kind of change that into language again, well, you can have that personal data.
Right.
So it doesn't necessarily store that data explicitly, but
Hmm.
because of the patterns it remembers,
Right.
it does store these patterns. And I think that's what you need to realize. And it's and the best practices we discussed as well is just, you need to anonymize it. You need to but also think about not just the name or some details. You need to think of what details am I actually putting in here, because in some contexts you can't figure it out.
Yes.
And I watched, I don't know, I can't remember where I saw this, but it was something about like the data that is collected, not medical,
Mhm.
but whether or not you're tracking the data. And these researchers are trying to look into, or journalists, what they were trying to look into, okay, can I figure out who it is? Like, who
Mhm.
has you been using these apps, I think it was. And they figure out, like, they walk to the door and ring the doorbell of that person who had the app at the end, because they could see and track that data and the IP addresses. And it's just like shocking seeing, okay, this is like all the data that is being collected. And I'm not saying that this is happening with all LLMs, but they have your IP address. They do understand the patterns of what you're, the prompts that you're typing in, and the outputs that you're using. So
Yeah.
again, just think
No,
about what type of data you add.
I completely agree with you. I'm gonna my next question. I think is a leading question, which I think I know the answer to, which is, in your opinion, are large language models safe for use in healthcare and education and legal environments that deal with sensitive information? I would assume the answer is no at this point, but there are institutions and organizations that are creating their own large language models that are locally hosted on their networks, and those where, because they're closed, I think those are definitely safe for use with sensitive information, but only those, not the ones that you kind of log in. So do you have any other further insights into those? I certainly would,
Yeah,
from a patient perspective, I would say definitely don't put anything
yeah,
in these models that are freely available, because I always, I joke with people when they're like, "Oh, this is, I use the free version." I'm like, "Well, free is not free. Free is,
exactly.
you're giving them your data. That's the exchange that's happening. That's the barter
Yeah,
system that's happening."
yeah. For sure, for sure. And I think, thank you for putting that out there,
Yeah,
because it's not free. Things are
right.
never free.
Things are never free.
Um,
That's just life rule 101, right? Nothing is free.
yeah. If it is too cheap, well, there's probably something else behind there,
There's something
right?
else. Yeah, exactly. But that's not to
Um,
say that it's not a good product, right? I mean,
no.
we are able to use it. I mean, I definitely use all of these models on a regular basis. I pay for a handful of them, but I use a handful of free ones as well. And they have their utility, but not in everything that I do across the
Mhm,
board. You know,
mhm,
and I
yeah.
think that's where we as humans need to understand that these are tools that can be leveraged for certain aspects of our work. There certainly are, and this is why I firmly believe that these tools are not going to replace what we do as human beings,
Mm,
because I feel we are not where we were, I would say, 30, 40 years ago, with the advent of the internet, where we
mhm,
were completely benign and didn't have an understanding of what this technology could do. I think we do have
yeah,
a better understanding as a society.
I agree. I agree.
Yeah.
We are further with like knowledge, and
Knowledge, yes.
yeah,
I mean, there's always pockets of lack of knowledge, but that's beside the
for
point.
sure,
I
for
won't go, I
sure.
won't go
But
there.
also, for like, if I just take myself, there's also things where I'm like, oh, of course, like I didn't realize that they also collect my data, or I didn't realize
Right.
that they, for example, like Google Translate. I was discussing this with someone. It's like, okay, so what if you
Mhm.
use Google Translate to translate a letter for your patient?
Oh, yeah.
They track
That's
your data, and I didn't
they
realize it. Like, I haven't done it, but like such an easy thing to do. Like, I 100% understand if people use Google Translate to translate
yeah,
for a patient with a different background. Um, and adding, okay, you can maybe take away like the name, okay, hey, Mr. Blah blah
yeah,
blah, but still the rest of the information would also be translated. And what can you get from that information? So I think the more we learn, the more we actually realize we haven't understood before as well. And so simple things like you also mentioned, okay, Google, they track everything. Yes, they do. So it's not safe. Everything's not safe. The patient data is not safe just because you
yeah,
put it in there, like with good faith.
yeah.
Um, But to answer your question about the LLMs and like if you can use it for like in healthcare, education, or legal environments, I'd say it really depends on what you're going to use it for.
Right.
Right? Because if you're thinking about more statistics or like help me understand a disease, help me understand this topic, like make this simple for me so I can understand it.
Right.
Great, use it. And but also be aware of hallucinations or some things that can be too simplified or things like that. But it does help doing the first research. And I remember
Yes.
when I was in junior high, that was like when Wikipedia started to become a thing. And you're like, okay, don't refer to Wikipedia.
Yeah.
Like, don't
Yes.
use it as a reference, right?
I do remember that.
And now later, well, my sister, she was like at the same stage, she's like, oh, of course we can use Wikipedia. I'm like, huh?
Yes.
So,
You are so correct. You are
yeah,
so correct.
yeah,
Because it was when it first came out, it was not considered a valid source
yeah,
for accurate information.
yeah,
That has actually since been changing and I would say debunked for a lot of part. I mean, not everything, but
yeah.
I will definitely say Wikipedia has really upped its game in terms of being able to be at least
Mhm.
some semblance of a source of starting point
Yeah,
for,
exactly.
and that's how I would view a lot of these large language models. They're starting points for thought ideation,
Exactly.
and perhaps some sentence restructuring here and there, not necessarily from a healthcare perspective, um, a substitution for your own critical thinking process
Hmm.
when you're addressing a patient, because the other part of it is there is no such thing as a perfect prompt,
Yeah.
right? Because no matter if you are trying to, let's say, come up with a differential diagnosis for a patient, you will inadvertently leave out information that the large language model thought will completely change
Hmm.
what they were going to the model would present for you as a differential diagnosis, which makes
Hmm.
what you do even more important,
Hmm.
because you have the ability to say, yeah, this third diagnosis that it gave me is completely off, like based
Hmm.
on the patient sitting in front of me. And so that's where your critical judgment really overrides the model.
Yeah.
I also don't like the term thinking when it comes to models, because that's not really what
Yeah, it
they're
doesn't think.
doing. Um, I joke with my kids, they're not thinking, they're mathing, because that's really what it is.
Yeah.
It's doing math at a very advanced and fast pace, and it is giving you probabilities
Hmm.
of the words that it's going
Hmm.
to that are most likely to probabilistically, excuse me, present
Hmm.
as the next sequence in that
Exactly.
sentence. So it's not really thinking; it's mathing.
Exactly.
I think we have to kind
It
of make that distinction.
is. Yeah,
Yeah.
but it is, and what you said about there, like about the critical thinking as well, is so important.
Yeah.
Um, there was a study that showed that one thing, if you're more insecure of like your
Mhm.
knowledge or
Yes.
what you know about a topic, then you'll lean towards LLMs much more if you're used to using that. I can imagine it's probably same for like Wikipedia back in the days, or like
Yeah.
still, or Google, or like you lean to a different source, or just your book,
Yeah.
from school or whatever. Um, so I think like if you're insecure, you're maybe just fresh from school, maybe you're still in school,
Mhm.
um, and you're trying to learn a topic, but you haven't gotten so much experience that you kind of know, like you just
Yeah.
know it. Um, so those those the people who are less secure and are less knowledgeable,
Mhm.
um, they tend to be less critical towards LLMs.
Yes.
Yeah.
They believe what it's putting out
They do, and
sooner,
I think
faster.
that's why you kind of need to keep that critical thinking along, because if you have a whole generation that are like fresh from school, like they just finished their like did their PhD, like ChatGPT helped them with her PhD, I don't know, and then they go out and like start
Yeah.
working, but they can't think themselves, like they're not critical to themselves. What type of society are we gonna go go
Well,
into?
yes, no, and I think that again, I'm so glad that we're having these conversations up front, because I think I'm old enough to remember the day I went to school before the internet,
Hmm.
was a thing. I was in college when it became more of a thing. But I'm old enough to remember that we did not ask these questions as a society when that inflection point in the technology curve happened, right? Like
Mm.
for us as a society. And I or maybe they were, and I was too young and naive to think that those conversations were being had. But I have not talked to anybody who remembers that these were, but we do need to have these conversations up front. And I'm so glad we're having the conversations about what is this doing to us in terms of a society for critical thinking, because especially in the healthcare domain, it is
Mm.
critically important that the human experience and the human touch and the human context be
Mhm.
kept at the forefront of every decision that we're
Mhm.
making. Amit and I, we often talk about that these are tools that really augment the work that we do. They
Yeah.
do not replace our clinical judgment and our clinical experience. Experience will still matter.
Mhm.
Um, does it make the novice or the new graduate who is just graduated from their med school or various healthcare profession a little bit more inclined to use these models to quote look up answers? Sure, but that's not going to replace the experience that they're going to need. That goes hand in
Mhm.
hand to your
Mhm.
point about just believing what the models spit out versus confirming
Yeah.
what the
Yeah.
model spit out,
Exactly.
right? Like
Yeah.
that's the difference. That's the
Yeah.
difference that we're trying to, and that's the shift that's happening, I think, in academia that I'm seeing as well, is that
Yeah.
more people are open to using these models, but we're still kind of finding that landscape of great. How do we teach students to learn how to confirm, right? Because they're still in that learning mode, and that's going to evolve
Mhm.
as we get better with adapting to what all of these models and AI brings to us. That brings me to the risk part of these. So there are risks of model leaks. There are prompt injection attacks that we've heard of, accidental data exposure, or not even accidental data exposures, data exposure. I think with DeepSeek, which was a big issue when DeepSeek first came out. I feel that hoopla has kind of died down with DeepSeek because most, at least in the US, I don't know what I'd be curious what Europe did for the most part. We didn't really seem to adopt it as much as because we were fearful of the privacy issues.
Mhm.
Was that your experience as well, Sigrid?
Yeah. Yeah. Same.
Same, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, I think I'm glad that the questions are being asked,
Mhm.
of these models.
Yeah.
Um, so let's talk about the risks of model leaks and prompt injection attacks. I know lots of people who they spend their entire day trying to break a large language model, and there's lots of ways to do it. I
Mm.
have other things to do. I occasionally try to break a model, but not the thing that makes my day really. But what happens, I guess, or what are the risks when we start trying to quote break a model?
Breaking the model or leaking
Or
data.
leaking the
Yeah.
data. Yeah, right.
Yeah, because breaking the model could be several
So
things.
several, yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
Leaking
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
data is probably the more
Yeah. Well, you mentioned as well, like on purpose, or is this like accidental, right? Or
right. Well, let's speak
accidentally.
accidental because on purpose we know that there's lots of other criminal
Yeah.
issues
Yeah.
that are related to that. Let's think accidental, I
Yeah.
guess.
So say that you have put in, it could have been anonymized data, it could have been, but it still has sensitive information in there. Because I think people need to realize also one thing. It's not, I've said it now already, but um, personal data is not just your name or your address or your phone
Yes.
number or email address, right? It's other things, the things that like put together. If people see those data
Yeah.
points together, they know, okay, it's me, like, or it's you. uh, so so they can put different data together, and then it identifies re-identifies, sorry.
Re-identifies. Yes, I get that.
um so with this like accidental leak, it's really put like by reproducing sensitive or confidential information again in their trading data. So say that with a
Mhm.
specific prompt that you use, it can be personal data, it can be even like source codes for like if you're like coding something. But uh, if you have a prompt that gives that as an output. You can
Yeah.
get information again if the data is being trained on that, right, the model is being trained on that data. So you have that, you have like this also models that contain sensitive data, and they might memorize it and later use it when prompted. So whether it's been triggered to prompt it,
Yeah.
or it's training leakage. So I think that is one of my biggest worries when it comes to that, and like personal data, because you don't know how the data is being used afterwards, how it's being trained, what's being trained for, which type of patterns it's going to recognize.
Right.
And one thing is, okay, we have the privacy part of it, but you also have risk of bias. So say that again, it's being trained on specific type of data, and it kind of confirm the bias it already has, or puts into new bias, because
Yes.
again, it's being trained on that, which again impacts, if it's in healthcare, impacts the treatment, the care a patient will get. So yeah, there are like, of course, like there are risks of like data privacy, and the risks of changing how a LLM reacts, like with bias, especially bias. That's what like I'm worried about about that.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, and I will say one of the things that I find very unnerving, I guess, and not that it stops me from using some of these in the right manner, but um, for the first 2 years of ChatGPT, and I'll just use ChatGPT as the example because it was the first one of the first ones that was most user friendly. It wasn't connected to the internet,
Hmm.
right? It was a closed large language model, obviously trained on several billions of parameters, but it was closed. It was not. It wasn't able to bring in current information off the internet. Now, when they added the web search feature um, onto their models, which all three of the models, Gemini, ChatGPT, and Claude, the ones that we're talking about today, all have that feature. They have the ability to search the web, which then begs the question, what have you put out on the web that
Mhm.
is potentially searchable? And what is it using off the web to then surface the answers that it is giving
Mhm.
you? We ran into this in very early versions of even in the closed models, because I'm sure you remember when Bing first came out with the bot that was trying to seduce the person and leave his wife and whatnot, which promptly got shut down, obviously. But now I'm wondering, like, now it searches the web. What
Yeah.
parts of the web is it searching, and what is it surfacing
Yeah.
to us? Which then again opens up the probability of the risks that we are dealing with here,
Hmm.
and also the risks to your own privacy.
Hmm.
It reminds me of this, and this is an older reference, Sigrid. I don't know if you remember, but back in the day, there was a on Facebook. There was I'm going to say project. It wasn't really a project, but it was basically everyone was being asked to share a photo of what their day was like. I don't know if you remember. This is a very older,
Hmm.
and I did not participate, but obviously on Facebook you saw all
Hmm.
people putting their day photo on there. That photo actually has more information in it than anything you can actually put in a prompt itself, because it's going to glean lots of information of where you uploaded that photo, where was it taken, what else is in that photo. There were people who had addresses on there and patient labels in the photo that they hadn't thought of, or a book that had their name on the side of the. So there's so much that you can extract that you
Hmm.
may not be thinking that you're putting out there, that these models now have access to.
Hmm.
And I'm not trying to scare everyone, but I just want everyone to kind of, again, pause, think about what you're asking this model to do, because whatever you're asking it to do, it's using to train something else somewhere else.
Mhm.
um yeah, I mean, any comments on that,
Yeah.
with the
Yeah, one thing is
connecting to
that,
the web?
yeah. One thing is what it's gonna what it's training it for, and like what type of data it uses.
Yeah.
I was thinking about this the other day, and it's like, say that you would write a scientific article, right?
Mhm.
But you use ChatGPT to write this article.
Yeah.
So you read this article and you publish this article, and then later someone's going to refer to this publication that you made on something that's like you don't even know you don't know it's true. You haven't checked the sources. Like it's just out there,
Yeah.
and then that article is going to be referred to again, used as a reference
Right.
for another article, and we go in loops. Like we just go in circles. It's like we're
That's
not
right.
developing anything. We're not like evolving. We're not.
Right.
Where are we? To me, it seems like we're just going in circles. So
Yeah.
if you put something like you use, okay, great, you can use ChatGPT or whatever tool you want to use to get ideas. I also use that for when I make posts on LinkedIn
Hmm.
to kind of get
Yeah.
ideas or insights or what could a different view on this topic be or whatever. But one thing I always look at the sources. Okay, does it make sense? I always critical. Okay, does what does it connect to or does it reflect things that I've seen before, experienced
Right.
before? Does it stand for what I'm standing for? And something if you start becoming critical towards it, you also see mistakes. But if you're not, so these mistakes are being published on
Right.
LinkedIn, in a blog, in a scientific article, whatever. They're being published and later referred to. And
Right.
how long haven't we not spent time to debunk uh, um, articles that show that vaccines lead to autism
Right.
that are
Yes.
not correct? We're still again going in circles. So this is even a big a societal everyone's just going in circles now. It's not just one
You're
research.
perpetuating the
Yeah,
yeah, the misinformation and
yeah,
disinformation there. No, you're absolutely right. As someone who does use, for my LinkedIn posts, summarizing articles, but that doesn't mean I haven't read the article myself and kind of read it to the point where I know if someone were to ask me about it, I know
hmm
what it's talking about, right? You do
yeah,
have to confirm. And I will say that there's a lot of times when I ask it to, let's say, extract statistics for me, it's not reading the statistics accurately, or interpreting, I should say,
yeah,
interpreting and so I often have to go and verify, like, is this really what it meant by sensitivity and specificity, or is this not reading it correctly? And so there's a little bit of
exactly.
that still happens. Now
Oh yeah,
obviously it'll get better, but that just to me behooves the human in the loop component
yeah,
of what all these models are, which
yeah,
is I still need to know what I'm talking about when I'm, and I
uh-huh,
will say I'm not the expert by any means, but I also wanted to make sure that I'm deepening my own expertise through the reading of these articles, not just putting them out there so that they're out
ex-
there for consumption, right?
yeah, yeah,
So there's a dual motivation for me, meaning
yeah,
I want to educate the public, but I'm also educating myself in the process. And I think that's the part where we all really need to learn how to leverage these models while keeping in mind the privacy and
mhm,
security concerns that we have. So shifting gears, I know you're in Europe. What does privacy compliance look like when it comes to GDPR or other regulations that you may know? What does that look
mhm,
like for you in your world?
yeah. So here GDPR is a big thing. It's been
Yeah.
a big thing for many years right now. And interestingly enough, I talked to someone today who from India, and she came to Europe as a law student, and that's when GDPR came out, and she's like, well. She was there like, is this a thing? Is this even needed? Is this why is this? Do we, because she wasn't used to that from
Yes.
India, which is was interesting having that conversation with her. It's like, oh, I didn't realize that this is for some societies really like, whoa, you have your data secured. So since I live in Europe, so it's not I don't need to be European for that. Yeah. So
Right. Of
I
course.
live in
Yes.
Europe. Yeah. Um, I have the right to be forgotten. That's like the main thing. So I have the right to tell someone or the company, okay, delete all the data that you have on me, and
Mm-hmm.
they're obliged by law to delete that within a certain time. Um, if whether they do that, that's something I always question, right? Do they
Well,
really
because
do?
I'm thinking about it from HIPAA on the US side. I don't know if they do that. I would have to question that.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I'm like, and but some things, some data, medical data, is a different story, yeah, because you
Yes,
have some
that's
data
true.
you have to have, yeah,
Yeah,
because there's
and
also
just for our audience, HIPAA is very much medical, healthcare data in the US. GDPR actually applies across the board
yeah,
beyond healthcare data, just for our audience
exactly, exactly.
knowledge.
So
Yeah,
any website I've been on, any data I've put anywhere,
yeah,
uh, my personal data, I should be have the right to be forgotten.
right.
But you also hear stories about, especially big tech, where they have money, so you could get a fine if you don't delete it. You can get a fine if you also process the data without permission. So that's also
Mm,
part of it. So processing the data.
mhm.
Um, but if you have the money to pay that fine, well,
They
that
don't
data
care.
is going to be worth more for you than actually paying that fine. So you kind of the risk
It's very
is not.
interesting.
Yeah. So I think, especially when it comes to LLMs, it's an interesting part, especially with LLMs and GDPR. So with this right to be forgotten. So say that I use patient data or other
Mhm,
type of data, use my own data, use someone's data
mhm.
in an LLM, and that LLM is going to process that data. So first of all, I have to have uh, consent in order to process that.
Mhm.
Did I ask my patient or whoever I use like the data from that I could process that data?
Which, by the way, I will say for our healthcare audience, especially US based, it is an excellent question to ask your patient. Do you mind if I go and ask this question that I have about your care on this model? Chances are your organization actually will have policies against that. Although I know a lot of EHRs now are incorporating
Mm,
some of these models, but those are closed within the EHR. If your institution has an EHR in which with that feature, you can certainly use it within that. But you can't really, in the context that Sigrid is talking about, you can't do
mm.
that right now.
Yeah, yeah,
Right.
and highly likely a patient already put their data in there already, but that's another.
That's true. Before they came to you, they put it in. You're right.
Let's be fair. But
Fair
that
enough.
doesn't mean that we shouldn't ask. We should
Right.
always ask. We should ask, like, is it okay that I put this in there?
Right.
And again, remove sensitive information, right? That could
That's right. That's right.
identify a patient. Um, so yeah, if you put that in there, the data in there, and then the patient says like, oh, but actually now I want the right to be forgotten. How does that
Yeah.
even work with LLMs? I
Yeah, I
wouldn't
have
know
no
it.
idea. Especially
Yeah.
now with the memory feature that at least
Hmm.
ChatGPT has, it remembers everything.
Yeah.
Remembers, I'm going to say,
Yeah.
and but yeah, I don't even know how that works, to be honest. Like that, I will definitely plead ignorance in that space
Hmm.
for my own knowledge. You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah. So
yeah.
I'm really curious. Like, is it possible to remove that data that you already put in there?
Very interesting. And my guess is the answer is no, especially
I
from a
also guess so.
GDPR perspective. I think the answer is no.
Hmm.
Um, maybe from a healthcare perspective, there might be some rules, but are they being followed? How do we verify they're being followed? We have no idea.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in this space.
Hmm.
So we have a couple more minutes left. This has been a great conversation. I have some questions from our audience. We'll start off with the first one we have here, which are there specific frameworks or models that healthcare institutions should adopt to ensure ethical AI use without compromising patient confidentiality? And I'm going to say, I'm not sure who asked this question, but I will put the caveat in there. I think it will be, and Sigrid, please weigh in on a deeper level, which is I think it'll depend on where you are and your organization.
Hmm. Yeah. So frameworks are being built some places. Like you have
Yeah.
in the EU, for example, you have the EU AI Act.
Yep.
So one of the things there I also want to highlight, because I think it's important, and it can support a bit with the trust and the ethics as well. So the EU AI Act, they want to make sure that the fundamental rights of EU citizens are taken care of, and it's
Yep.
built on GDPR. It's built on other type of laws as well. Um, and that it would be like that you won't impact those rights. So, for example, you use AI to figure out who to hire in a certain situation. Well, AI is full of bias, so that would impact the rights of those who have a fair
Mhm.
um, chance of being hired for a specific position, especially if you're a minority or if you're a female, things
Yep.
like this. So it has like rules of what can you use AI for and not. So there are some that are not allowed to be used, things that are not allowed in Europe but are allowed elsewhere.
Right.
Um, and then you also have risks of use. So as an organization, you need to think about what type of risk are there for every single way that you use those LLMs or AI in general. Yeah.
AI in general. Yeah.
Um, so am I risking, what type of risks do I have if I use LLMs to figure out a diagnosis for a patient? Well, that's going to be
Mhm.
high risk because it's medical. And if you
Yeah.
have high risk, you need to you have quite a lot of things you need to fulfill. So I know it's not an ethical framework at all, but it helps set the board a bit in Europe, and I think that's going to spread to other countries and continents, because that's what you see as well when you start with one. Well, see, they call Europe the exporter of regulations. So
That is very true. Although you guys have very excellent, excellent regulations. You're quite good at writing them.
that's why we're exporting them happily.
Well, it's really funny because I'm in the U.S. and then we have Amit who's in India, and Amit in India there is very few regulations around privacy and entering data. In fact, even EHRs are just starting to emerge in that space. But I find it very interesting that a lot of times US lags behind and EU is usually ahead of the curve when it comes to a lot of these regulations. US follows very closely behind. We're like, wait and see what happens, and then we'll kind of
Yeah.
adopt it, And I really enjoy watching the landscape of, and I'll use India just because I know that landscape from talking to Amit, which is they're able to kind of leapfrog over some of the issues that EU is dealing with, the US is dealing with, because we have a much more mature infrastructure when it comes to these regulatory things. And so sometimes we get in our own way when it comes to pivoting and shifting some of the regulatory structures that need to change as technology becomes more and more capable. Whereas places like India, because they're still developing it, they're able to leapfrog several generations of these regulatory effects and go to the most current or the most modern or the most futuristic type model. And that kind of lends itself well to some new innovations that allows them to innovate faster and scale a little bit faster, which then kind of reverse feeds into the regulatory ecosystem, if I may.
Mm.
So all of them have, I think, their pros and cons. It's great to be the leader, which I think EU is when it comes to this. US is a little bit behind. I mean, it comes with its own pros and cons, like
It
many do,
does.
right? Yeah, but
It
I
does.
think I would feel great as a patient if I lived in the EU and I had GDPR on and the EU AI Act on my back. So definitely, I would say don't shy away from it.
Mm.
We're going to close it out, actually. I have one last question here. If you had to set one rule for how large language models handle data, what would it be and why?
Hmm. I think it summarizes a bit of our conversation today,
Yeah.
honestly. So I'd say, first of all, make sure that so it's a dual. Okay.
Yeah.
Make sure that the personal information is de-identified and that you have consent to use that data.
That's right. I think absolutely consent and de-identify
Yeah.
are definitely things and consent for yourself as well as for the patient that you're seeing. Or I mean, it doesn't even have to be a patient; it could be
Mm.
anything, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then disclosure, of course, of
Yeah.
if you're using these models.
Yeah.
Well, Sigrid, I really appreciate this conversation. It's been a pleasure to have you. I'm sure our audience is going to love hearing this conversation as we release it on YouTube. Please join us next month when we will have another interesting conversation with another leader in the AI space. Sigrid, thank you. Hippie, I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Deepu and Sigrid. It was such a wonderful conversation, and actually, we all brought such clarity and passion and purpose to this discussion. So, a very big thank you to everybody. And to our audience, your questions, your engagement, and your curiosity is what keeps this series alive. So, until next time, and until we meet again in the next month, stay curious, stay ethical, and let's build a smarter, more human future healthcare together. See you all next time. Thank you. Hello, we're done.
We're done?
Yes.
Great.
Okay, thank you,
Sigrid, thank
everybody.
you so much. I can't tell if she's still here, but thank you, Sigrid.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Hippie. All right.
Thank you, Deepu.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye. Have a great day.
Bye.